Hi, my name is Maryanne Blahut, and this is the story of my mother's childhood. Growing up, my three sisters and I would beg our mom to tell us stories about growing up in the 70s. I think that we were so fascinated with her past because it was both so similar and so different from our own. Like us, my mother is one of three sisters. She lived in a Massachusetts suburb and attended public schools. Even though we shared these life traits, my mom tells stories about her youth that never could have occurred in my own. It's during family events especially that my mother and her three sisters, my aunts, would all come together and tell us stories of spending Christmases in the psych ward, being abandoned in Sears department stores, or running after trucks that were spraying DDT, bathing in the chemical clouds. To this day, I still find comparing and contrasting my mother's childhood with my own to be somewhat fascinating. This is her story.
Maryanne Catherine Burns Blahut. I was born January 19th, 1902. I guess that makes me 48. At Eunice Circle, which I don't really remember. And then I moved to Linfield, and I lived there. I have three older sisters. My mother's name was Janet. My father's name was James Francis Burns. And they divorced when I was very young, maybe when I was 2 or 3. He was Catholic, she was Protestant. There were a lot of religious problems between the two of them. And, they got married. Her siblings couldn't be in the wedding because they weren't Catholic and they couldn't be on the same altar as other people. I know when my sisters and I were baptized, there were stories that, we were christened in one church and baptized in the other, so I never really quite messed with the whole religious differences.
My mom was born in 1962, which was 2 years before the Civil Rights Movement of 1964. This movement outlawed unequal application of voter registration requirements and racial segregation from schools, at the workplace, and by faculties that serve the general public. In the years leading up to and after this landmark legislation, there were countless sit-ins, boycotts, and strikes for the advancement of equality for African Americans. The main leaders for this movement were the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Mary McLeod Bethune, John Brown, Frederick Douglass, and Marcus Garvey. My mom says she doesn't remember much about the civil rights movement. This is probably both due to her young age at the time and the fact that she grew up in a fairly non-racist and racially accepting neighborhood.
We're not racist or, had any leanings in that direction. I think that I grew up when METCO was just starting, so that was something new.
METCO stands for the Metropolitan Council for Education Opportunity. This Boston-based program allows minority families from Boston and Springfield, Mass. To send their children to a suburban school system. This voluntary program was founded in 1966. The METCO program is a good example of how the 70s began as a me decade, a decade in which many people were making changes in their lives and moving forward in society. My mom was 13 years old and an 8th grader at Linfield Middle School when the Vietnam War, which lasted from November 1st, 1955 to April 30th, 1975, finally ended. This war was fought between the Communist North Vietnam, supported by its Communist allies, and the government of South Vietnam, supported by the United States and other anti-communist nations. The United States feared that a communist takeover of South Vietnam was in the future. To prevent this, they joined the war in the late 1950s. U.S. involvement escalated in the early 1960s. The casualties of this war were extensive. In total, 3 to 4 million Vietnamese from both sides were lost, as well as 1.5 to 2 million Laotonians and Cambodians, and 58,159 U.S. soldiers. While the Vietnam War was one of the most unpopular in the history of America and brought on strikes, anti-war music, and boycotts, my mom says that she remembers very little of it. I think that's probably because, as young kids, her sisters and her were more focused on having a good time rather than thinking about a bad time.
The part that I remember from the Vietnam War were people wearing bracelets and me really wanting to get a bracelet with, a POW's name on it. But that was pretty much the extent of it.
While the Vietnam War was being fought overseas, another war was being fought in America. The mid-1960s brought on a new wave of feminism. This was the war for female civil rights. After a highly patriarchal decade of the 1950s, women were fed up with their second-class status in society. The 60s and the 70s were a time of female rebellion. Though many women were busy fighting, boycotting, and striking for equal rights in the workplace, many still played the role of stay-at-home mother and wife. My grandmother actually would have preferred to stay at home, but circumstances forced her to remain in the workplace.
You know, what had happened in my family was my father was a lawyer. She was a nurse, but she certainly didn't have any intention of working after she had children. Ultimately, what happened is they divorced. He moved to San Francisco, and my mother, had 4 children to support. And so she did go back to work full time. And I think that was really hard for that point in history. It was also really difficult being a child of, they never actually divorced because there was this whole Catholic thing that, you would have to get an annulment, and, they had 4 children, blah, blah, blah. So that never happened, but they never actually divorced. So, but I remember things, growing up in Linfield, which was, at that point kind of an upper middle class town, and people not playing with my older sisters because, their parents were divorced. So
Really?
I remember them being kicked out of the Girl Scout troop. Yeah, it was very mean, but it was a very different time then. And it would have been, they came from a broken home.
The 1970s was a very socially progressive era. Commonly referred to as the Me Decade, most Americans were working towards self-improvement and finding new freedoms for themselves. Some of these freedoms came in the form of rock music, sexual freedom, generated from the new birth control pill, and heavy drug use. During this time period, my grandmother worked as a psych nurse.
She was a psychiatric nurse. Her experience was working with many, seriously demented, for lack of a better word, demented, but, and I can tell stories about, spending Christmases in psych wards and different things like that. But there were a lot of people that were using a lot of drugs in the 70s, kind of leftovers from the 60s, and people that had been burned out on heroin and just a lot of really bad drugs. And so I think she always had this fear that we would become alcoholics or drug users. So that was a very big piece of kind of her worry as a parent.
As my mom says, my grandmother tended to be much more focused on her career as a psych ward nurse rather than focusing mainly on her 4 children.
So there wasn't really a lot of pressure in terms of, wanting us to achieve. But I think that in some ways it was a good balance because the town that I lived in, similar to Wayland at that point, a lot of kids were really pushed, and that wasn't her objective. She was more worried that, we'd be healthy and happy.
I think my mom's parenting tactics are in some way reflective of her mother's, with some definite variations. Like her mother, my mom would not be defined as a helicopter parent, meaning she is certainly not over-involved in me or my sister's lives. On the other hand, she is definitely more interested in what my sisters and I are doing than her mother ever was.
It was the 70s, and it was a different time, and you could be a lot looser in your parenting. She didn't know where we were most of the time. She didn't know what grade I was in, so, she didn't know what my homework was. She didn't necessarily know my teachers' names. And it's not that she was a bad parent, but she certainly wasn't, my education or my day-to-day existence wasn't the bane of her existence. She very much, had her own life, and as did we.
The 1970s was a decade of change. Between the Vietnam War, the sweep of feminism, rock music, and drug use, people were busy exploring new social extremes and behaviors. My mother's story is probably similar to many others, but the way her upbringing has affected my own is what makes her childhood so interesting to me. With this new millennium, a new breed of parents have been created. It seems like a lot of parents who grew up in the 70s have turned into helicopter parents. I think that my mother's ability to find a happy medium between the helicopter parent of the 2000s and the uninterested parent of the 1970s is what makes her so special.